Nuestra invitada de hoy es una de las intelectuales feministas más relevantes del mundo. Marxista heterodoxa, ha explicado con gran lucidez los límites que el capitalismo impone a la emancipación de las mujeres. En Otra Vuelta de Tuerka, Fraser. Fraser, bienvenida a Otra Vuelta de Tuerka.
Thank you. Great to be here.
En este programa nos gusta mucho el psicoanálisis y siempre preguntamos por la infancia de nuestros invitados. Yo sé que eres hija por parte de padre de una familia de migrantes judíos polacos y por parte de madre de migrantes irlandeses, y que además siempre tuviste mucha admiración por las mujeres rebeldes de la familia de tu madre que se opusieron a los convencionalismos. Quiero preguntarte cómo son tus experiencias de infancia en esa familia.
Yeah, that's right. I'm Jewish, but I do have this line of Irish Catholicism. And the Jewish part of my family was always aspiring to be middle class, to be truly American and rather conventional. But my maternal grandmother was a bit of a rebel. I don't know this for sure, but I believe that she might have herself been an illegitimate child. Wow. She had a hard life and ran away from home and had to fend for herself, but she had a great spirit, and I've always identified with that side of her. The other thing that was important about my childhood, though, is that I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, in a period when it was a Jim Crow segregated city, racial apartheid. So African Americans were not allowed to eat in the same restaurants, use hotels, swimming pools, et cetera, et cetera. And the formative experience of my youth was the struggle for desegregation and civil rights. And that was my first political engagement, and it really formed me in a very deep way for everything I've done subsequently.
Te quiero preguntar específicamente por Baltimore. Baltimore es una ciudad que ha servido para estudiar las relaciones entre clase e identidad y que se ha hecho famosa a nivel mundial a partir de una serie que es una genialidad, The Wire, de David Simon, en la que el protagonista es la ciudad y de alguna manera esas relaciones tan complejas entre sistema económico, clase trabajadora, las comunidades afroamericanas, lo que implica la educación, han convertido Baltimore en una referencia sociológica a nivel mundial para entender esas relaciones entre capitalismo, etnia, raza, incluso género también. Te quiero preguntar por esa experiencia como niña y como ciudadana de Baltimore.
Yeah, it's true. The Wire has certainly really given a kind of anatomy, a social anatomy of the city, of its politics, of its divisions of class, race, and ethnicity. What's interesting is that I grew up in a middle-class suburb, which was quite separate and protected from the poverty, from the racial, and we were far away from the industrial areas, far away from the African American neighborhoods. So I had a rather sheltered life, and I rebelled against that. I felt that the world I was living in was sanitized, boring, safe. I felt cut off. And frankly, one thing that was very important to me in getting involved in politics, in civil rights struggle, in anti-Vietnam War struggle, was the way it opened up the city to me. By virtue of my political engagements, I came into contact with people whom I otherwise would never have met. I went to see parts of the city that I had never been to before. So a whole new world opened up to me through that, and it was an extremely important experience which allowed me to reinterpret my childhood, to understand better how privileged it was, how isolated it was, how it depended on a huge amount of labor and exploitation elsewhere, but which it treated as invisible. So that was quite eye-opening to me.
Tu experiencia universitaria, estudias filosofía, está marcada por un movimiento estudiantil que no solamente es un movimiento político muy importante en los Estados Unidos, es un movimiento cultural, de renovación también en términos intelectuales. Es decir, el movimiento contra la guerra del Vietnam, el movimiento por los derechos civiles, lleva aparejada, digamos, una lectura de los clásicos diferentes. Tú, de alguna manera, te ubicas en un marxismo heterodoxo. Digamos, ¿cómo es tu primer contacto intelectual y político con el marxismo? Y, digamos, ¿cuáles son las claves de un pensamiento que es enormemente renovador y que será clave para los estudios en las décadas siguientes del sistema económico?
Yeah. Well, what's interesting is that I knew nothing of Marxism. Part of this childhood that I'm explaining to you cut me off from the radical traditions of the United States and of the world. And you have to also factor in that McCarthyism in the United States was so powerful in suppressing any knowledge of radical thinking, and certainly anything to do with Marxism or communism. So I grew up in an educational system that never mentioned capitalism, never mentioned imperialism, never mentioned Karl Marx or let alone any left Western Marxists. For me, by becoming involved in the New Left, I suddenly discovered a whole continent of thinking that I never knew existed before. And this was an eye-opening, revelatory experience. But as you say, it was the time of the New Left. It was the '68 moment. So the radicalism of our time was not the radicalism of the 1930s. And I was reading Marx, Engels, Gramsci, all of the classics through the lens of the 60s. And that was a lens that was rejecting the conformism of corporate culture, the emptiness of suburban life, and was looking for a more intense set of social relations. The 60s were a time of new left rediscovery of Marxism, but also of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. So it was a very heady mix of stuff. And I could never really relate to the very orthodox forms of Marxism, although I did go through a period in a sort of quasi-Trotskyist sect for a little while, but that didn't really fit who I was. And so I have tried ever since, as a philosopher, to figure out how to synthesize the indispensable insights of Marxism with the insights of feminism, of ecology, of anti-imperialist and anti-racist thinking, and with this spirit, the emancipatory spirit of 1968.
Digamos, uno de los problemas históricos de las lecturas que se han hecho del marxismo era que se centraban fundamentalmente en equivalencias políticas vinculadas a la estructura económica. Será probablemente Gramsci el que ponga encima de la mesa la importancia de la cultura o de todos los elementos que operan en la superestructura. Esto ha sido una de las claves en tu trabajo teórico, la relación de alguna forma entre identidad y clase social y la posición que alguien ocupa en el proceso productivo. Sin embargo, digamos, quizá la noción teórica más importante que has desarrollado es el concepto de justicia social, social justice. querría que me explicaras las características fundamentales, porque no es un concepto tan sencillo, de tu trabajo para describir la justicia social.
Right. Yeah, I've tried to develop a way of thinking about social justice that is broad enough to include not only problems of class inequality and class exploitation and domination, but also gender inequality and domination, also ecological issues, also democracy, the political organization of society, racial ethnic division. All of these are fundamental to social justice. And when I was studying philosophy at university, we were taught a very narrow understanding of social justice, that it was all about what was called distribution. So distribution, no one cares how the wealth is produced. That's a black box, forget that. Just look at how it's distributed. So this reduced everything to the most conventional economic thinking. It excluded questions of our relation to nature. It excluded questions of the relation between production and reproduction. It excluded the question of the relation between the political sphere of society and the economic sphere. And it even excluded the organization of production itself. So I tried to think about social justice in a way that could include these other issues. And one key insight that I had was that there was a whole order of recognition in society over and above this question of distribution that needed to be thought about. And what I mean by recognition is the way that status hierarchies are entrenched structurally in capitalist societies. It's not just about wage work, the relation between labor and capital and exploitation in the factory. There's a whole array of status hierarchies that are institutionalized. So we have the distinction, for example, between free majority ethnicity workers and either unfree or dependent racialized others who are not actually exploited so much as expropriated. Their labor and their assets are essentially seized by capital, and capital does not in return pay their costs, or at least their full costs of reproduction. Capital supposedly pays the full reproduction costs for exploited workers, but in the case of racialized expropriated workers, it doesn't. So that's a structural feature of capitalist society that is premised on a status distinction between the unfree and the dependent. And of course, that corresponds globally as well as nationally to the color line. That's what Du Bois called it, the color line. So it's about the construction of race as a status distinction that is not strictly a class distinction. I could make a very similar argument about gender, which has to do with the structural division in a capitalist society between production and reproduction, between paid labor, let's say in a factory setting, which is aimed at producing commodities for the sake of capitalist profit on the one side, and then the often, not always, but often unpaid labor of producing people, giving birth to them, caring for them, socializing them, feeding them, clothing them, educating them, all of that labor which is divided from production. And in capitalist societies, that's a gender distinction. So it establishes a status hierarchy of gender. Again, this is not in people's heads. Recognition is sometimes thought of to be a matter of prejudice or nasty ideas about other people. No, I think these are real structural questions in capitalist society that have not been adequately theorized by Marxist in the past, although it's true that Engels actually made some very interesting theories about this gender aspect. But I've tried to develop a way of thinking about social justice that incorporates this problem of status, or if you want to call it recognition, as well as the problematic of the economic structure, the class structure, which is what distribution is supposed to be about.
Es evidente que esa lectura economicista del marxismo, que decía que había una contradicción fundamental, la contradicción capital-trabajo de las que deberían derivar todas las demás, no explicaba los procesos políticos y tampoco explicaba las revoluciones clásicas. La revolución rusa, la revolución china no se puede explicar entendiéndolas exclusivamente como revoluciones de clase. Mencionabas a Dubois, Frantz Fanon en África explica, digamos, ciertas torpezas del marxismo europeo para explicar cómo los procesos identitarios son absolutamente funcionales a los sistemas de dominación económico. Y el feminismo pone encima de la mesa que las cuestiones identitarias tienen que ver directamente con la manera en la que funciona la reproducción social en un sistema económico concreto. Aquí la pregunta viene respecto a las contradicciones que tú detectas en esa relación entre las diferentes dimensiones en clave contradictoria de la justicia social. Cómo la redistribución puede entrar en contradicción con el reconocimiento. La pregunta no es fácil, pero, digamos, ¿cómo configura esto la política? Si la política, si la subjetivación implica que diferentes demandas se tienen que ordenar para construir el movimiento político, para construir la reivindicación política, digamos, ¿cuál sería en el momento actual en clave emancipatoria la manera en la que esas contradicciones se pueden ordenar, o si por desgracia estamos condenados a que no haya una política emancipatoria que pueda ordenar las diferentes contradicciones?
Well, I appreciate the complexity of the question, and we have to, it's difficult, but we have to think at this level of complexity, because if we simply just think everything follows automatically from the economic structure, we won't get anywhere. We won't be able to understand what's happening now, and we won't be able to intervene politically in an effective way in the present conjuncture. So I would say that, first of all, I've been talking, first of all, at the structural level about class, gender, and race ethnicity as structural questions. It's not that class is structural and gender and race are not. They're all structural. But none of them actually tell us how people live these relations. Politics is about how people live the structural relations. It's about the discourses that are available to them through which they interpret their experience. Do they have a language that allows them to think and to say, I am being treated unjustly, I am being exploited, I am being expropriated, I am being sexually harassed or assaulted. In some periods, people have lived these relations without having the language to describe them, without having the ability to say what this is and why it's wrong, and therefore without having the ability to oppose it. Now, what's interesting about our time is that more and more we have available to us language for naming these injustices and for opposing them. And that's obviously a great advance. However, it's also the case that we have forces that try to appropriate our language and use it for different ends. So, for example, we have a lot of white supremacists now who say that they are discriminated against. They use the language of the civil rights movement to claim that they are an oppressed minority. We even have, in some cases, of men who claim to be an oppressed gender because women are getting special treatment and affirmative action, and so on and so forth. So we don't own the language. The language can be used against us and we have to be very smart about how to deal with that. Let me give you one contemporary example. In the US, and I think in many other countries, the ruling hegemonic bloc in the last decades has been what I call progressive neoliberalism. It's an alliance of finance and symbolic capital, Wall Street, Hollywood, Silicon Valley, with the mainstream conventional liberal currents of social movements. Now, those interests in finance and capital have basically hegemonized these liberal movements and taken their language and presented themselves as pro-gay, pro-environmental, pro-woman, et cetera, et cetera. And so the more radical currents of these movements have found themselves dispossessed of their own language. This is a contradictory situation, and it creates a problem for how to intervene in such a way as to break this progressive neoliberal alliance, claim our issues and our language back to make a new, more radical political intervention.
Los posobreristas, Toni Negri y sus chicos, decían que el neoliberalismo había sido capaz de construir una contrarrevolución cultural poniendo todos los valores del 68, todos los valores de la revolución del 68, a trabajar en favor del neoliberalismo. Te he leído algo muy provocador a propósito de la segunda ola del feminismo. Si la primera ola del feminismo habría implicado una crítica al capitalismo androcéntrico, señalas provocadoramente, esto ha podido levantar muchas ampollas, señalas que la segunda ola se podría haber convertido en algunos casos en un elemento legitimador de la explotación y de las políticas de gobernanza neoliberal. Esto es un tema muy actual en España, donde el auge del feminismo en los últimos años se ha convertido en el primer movimiento social, y cuando digo movimiento social no me refiero a colectivos que se movilizan, sino a un movimiento subterráneo que está empujando a toda la sociedad en España, digamos, de una manera sin precedentes históricos, donde han aparecido reacciones neoliberales muy explícitas. Un partido político, Ciudadanos, que hace un año, digamos, trataba de descalificar las movilizaciones feministas como movilizaciones de gente de extrema izquierda y nos acusaba a nosotros de ser los organizadores, hoy reivindica un concepto de feminismo liberal que no es más que un intento de utilizar, bueno, pues ciertos elementos del nuevo lenguaje para entender la explotación que el feminismo ha puesto encima de la mesa para reproducir, digamos, estructuras sociales de dominación. ¿Te preocupa, digamos, que esa segunda ola o los restos teóricos de esa segunda ola sirvan para desactivar un movimiento emancipatorio tan potente y que tiene en el presente unas potencialidades mayores que los movimientos sociales tradicionales, como el propio movimiento obrero?
So I really think the key thing is to think historically about these questions. So second wave feminism erupted in the early 1970s, and this was the same moment that neoliberalism was just beginning, right? Now, it was a moment in which the previous form of capitalism, social democracy, was entering a crisis. But second wave feminism, like all of the movements of that time, was not fully aware that they were on the brink of a major shift in society, a major transformation of capitalism from a state-managed social democratic form to a neoliberal globalizing financialized form. We, and I'll include myself, were still thinking that social democracy was more or less secure and that what we had to do was go further. It never occurred to us that capitalism would be transformed in such a way that there would be tremendous regression, tremendous increase in inequality and wealth and exploitation. So we were not prepared for the new period. We kept thinking in the old way. And in time, that caught up with us and proved a problem. And in time, the radical spirit of the 1960s and of early second wave feminism disintegrated. Liberalism reasserted itself, as it always does in the United States and in some other liberal countries. And that means people emphasize individualism, consumerism, family, domestic privatism. So feminism and other social movements adapted to this new climate, and the liberal wings became the dominant wings, and the more radical socialist and Marxist currents became very minoritarian, very subordinate, almost invisible. So what's happened now, though, we fast forward now another 30 years or so, neoliberal capitalism meets a crisis. We have obviously the 2007-08 financial crisis, but also the crisis of work, the deindustrialization, the relocation of manufacturing to the global south, the financialization, the rise of debt, both state debt and private debt, consumer debt, so that working class families are no longer able to manage in the way that they were. And all of that creates a crisis for neoliberalism, and obviously climate change is now, right? We are aware of this, we are worried about it, we know that it's real. So there's a sense of a general crisis of society. Now, this is a moment when things get interesting because people stop thinking in the old way. I spoke before about the languages and the common sense of the time. No one any longer believes the common sense of neoliberalism. No one believes in trickle down, that if we reduce the taxes on the wealthy, that it will be better for all of us. These things were the common sense of the previous period, but they have no credibility anymore. So interestingly, feminism today has become a powerful force in this confused, disoriented political vacuum that we're in. There's a struggle for hegemony. Who will be able to create a new project, a new counter-hegemonic bloc to replace the old one? I think that because of the weakening of trade unions and the decline of industrial work, that a lot of radical militancy has shifted from production to social reproduction. In other words, struggles over public education, over housing, over transport, over health care. This is the realm of of elder care, of child care. This is the realm of social reproduction as opposed to economic production. In the 1930s, the center of radicalism in that crisis was industry, right? It was the struggle to form trade unions, to win labor rights, to stabilize industrial work. Today, the center of struggle is this social reproduction sphere, the areas that social democracy claimed to take responsibility for, but from which it's been forced to withdraw. And because this sphere is gendered, the industrial sphere was the male sphere, social reproduction was supposed to be the female sphere. Because this sphere is gendered, that means that women's activism and feminist activism is front and center today. But what kind of activism is it going to be? What is the worldview? What is the project? What is the ideology of this feminism? Well, there are still powerful liberal feminist elements, as you mentioned here in Spain and certainly in the United States as well. The progressive neoliberals are trying to win back the power that they have lost. So I think we're going to see a struggle between different feminisms, between liberal feminism, between what I call the feminism for the 99% and possibly other variants as well. A struggle for hegemony within feminism.
Esto es fascinante, que se produzca, digamos, una lucha por los significados. Es evidente que el feminismo ha creado una gramática que se está demostrando transversal en todos los ámbitos. Yo soy muy friki de las series de televisión Y me sorprende cómo temas feministas que estaban absolutamente ocultos en dispositivos de producción cultural como el cine empiezan a aparecer de manera normalizada en series mainstream, desde Mad Men hasta series como The Fall. Hay una irlandesa, Rebellion, que habla del alzamiento de Pascua, que incluso para describir unos acontecimientos, digamos, como muy ubicados históricamente, el elemento de género aparece, y eso, o sea, yo creo que es enormemente hermoso, lo que está implicando, digamos, que los temas del feminismo sean transversales a todos los dispositivos culturales, y cómo está redefiniendo incluso la política, cómo afecta a la propia izquierda, que siempre se creyó como ajena a determinados debates. Pero en la construcción de esa gramática, digamos, dentro de esa pelea, hay nociones que adquieren mucha importancia. Tú hablabas antes de la crisis del trabajo. El trabajo ha sido históricamente una noción muy masculina, muy vinculada a la forma fábrica, a la forma sindicato, que ejemplificaba a un varón, en muchos casos blanco, organizado en un sindicato y con una bandera roja como simbología de su emancipación. Hay una noción que tú has trabajado mucho, cadenas globales de cuidados, que sirve para entender cómo funcionan contradicciones de clase que en estos momentos pueden tener a las mujeres como protagonistas políticos. Querría preguntarte por el significado de esta noción, cadenas globales del cuidado. Si el trabajo asociado a la fábrica fue durante muchos años hegemónico para entender la política de la izquierda, asociada a figuras masculinas, ¿en qué medida cadenas globales de cuidados puede ser determinante para entender las formas de subjetivación política en el siglo XXI?
Right. So just a second. I agree with you that this explosion of gender representation in the media and in popular culture and in mass culture is extremely interesting. But I would simply point out that much of it follows this sort of individualist trajectory. It's all about a woman who manages to succeed despite discrimination. And so it's the story of meritocracy winning out over discrimination. And that is a fundamentally liberal ideal and not adequate for the feminism of our time. Now, I also agree with you about this idea, this older representation of work, as you described it. But what feminists have shown is that actually work is much broader than that, and that we need a new understanding of what work is. Work includes service work, people who work in hospitals, hotels, restaurants. This is the face of work today, not just the factory. It includes people who do housework, whether they're paid for it or whether they're cleaning someone's else's house or whether it's their own. Now, about the global care chains, what I would say is that here you see the real nub of the contradiction of this problem of progressive neoliberalism. Progressive neoliberalism and the feminism that has been part of it is the feminism of the professional managerial class. Exactly those women represented in the TV series, those who are trying to climb the corporate ladder and win success. Now, they are able to do that to the extent that they are because they are relying on low-wage, often migrant and racialized women to do their care work, to take care of their children, to clean their homes, to organize all of the sort of social reproductive labor that those women would otherwise have had to do. And that really introduces a fundamental class division and a fundamental division of race or color into this whole question of social reproduction and into the question of who feminism is really for, which women is feminism for. So in other words, the whole issue of migration and especially women's migration, is about people coming to do the care work for the white, educated, professional women who are out in the corporate world trying to rise. And I've tried to think about how we can develop another feminism that puts the situation of the paid migrant care workers at the center instead of the corporate liberal feminists who are working in the banks or in the corporations.
Te quiero preguntar por este libro que aparece también en castellano, en el que has participado, Manifiesto de un feminismo para el 99%. Háblame de lo que contáis aquí.
Yeah. So it's a work that I co-authored with two other women, Cinzia Arruzza, who is an Italian Marxist feminist living in New York, and Tithi Bhattacharya, who is a British Indian feminist living in the US in the Midwest. This is the first piece of really political agitational writing that I have done in many, many decades.
No es un trabajo académico.
No. Since my days as a New Left activist, I have basically been a philosophy professor. But there's something about living in this moment where I felt it's absolutely essential to do something else in addition to my philosophical work. The three of us had, each in her own way, been working on issues to do with Marxist or socialist feminism, issues of gender, class, race. But we decided to join forces and try to write this piece of agitational literature. It really is a manifesto. It's inspired, perhaps, by the Communist Manifesto, although that's such a work of genius we couldn't possibly hope to equal. But it's organized in the form of 11 theses. And the aim is to try to describe the crisis situation of the present, the way that issues of gender are situated in this conjuncture, to try to describe how liberal feminism colonized all of feminism and gave it a bad name by associating it with neoliberalism, how the hegemony of liberal feminism is collapsing, and how the emergence of the new March 8th movements and the international women's strike movements are emerging and have the chance to offer a new kind of feminism, and also not just feminism as a separatist movement, but feminism as part of a broader coalition of anti-capitalist forces and movements and political parties that could offer a new project at the moment of neoliberal crisis when the whole world wants something different. So we are trying to articulate how to think about this moment, how to think about the real sources of gender asymmetry, which have to do with the structural organization of capitalism, its division between production and reproduction as a gendered division, how to avoid the trap of assuming that we have only two options, either a horrible right-wing xenophobic populism or close ranks with the liberals, go back to progressive neoliberalism. Those are the two options that we are presented with, and we are saying no. We decline both of those options. We want instead to be part of a left-wing anti-capitalist or left populist movement that is tackling every facet of the current crisis: the crisis of care, the crisis of climate, the crisis of democracy, the crisis of paid work and of debt, and the crisis of migration and racism and xenophobia. An alternative for our time has to be able to encompass all of this, has to understand the structural bases of these issues in the organization of capitalism, has to understand the forms of political projects that have created these problems and that are trying still to manage the crisis. And we have to develop an alternative. That's what the feminism for the 99% is.
Aquí está señalando probablemente la gran dificultad de la política en estos momentos, y lo expresabas muy bien. La crisis del neoliberalismo no tiene necesariamente traducciones políticas emancipatorias. El populismo reaccionario que describías es probablemente una de las consecuencias de la crisis de hegemonía de las formas de gobernanza neoliberal. Y señalabas esa trampa de la política de verse como dos opciones, o digamos el liberalismo, entendiendo lo que se entiende en los Estados Unidos o en las culturas anglosajonas por la palabra liberal, cierto liberalismo progre, frente al reaccionarismo del populismo blanco. Yo tengo la sensación de que las elecciones en Estados Unidos enfrentando a Donald Trump y a Hillary Clinton tenían algo de esa trampa de la política, de estas son las opciones. Pero claro, aquí entramos en la crítica fundamental a la izquierda. ¿Qué tendría que hacer la izquierda política y la izquierda social para navegar las contradicciones de un momento político en los que se está viendo que esas dificultades son enormes para construir una propuesta que sea capaz de surfear esas dos tendencias que encierran el campo de lo políticamente posible?
Well, I think we have to really reimagine the whole structure of society. Because it's a moment of acute crisis, it's a moment where we should think big. We can't any longer look for small piecemeal reforms. We have to think about big structural changes. And I believe that neoliberalism at the moment is in such trouble that there will be a big structural change. The question is which change and who will be which forces will succeed in making the change they want, and in whose interest will this change be made. So for me, the starting point is to take what I call an enlarged view of what capitalism is. Capitalism is not just an economic system, it's a whole social order, comparable, say, to feudalism. We need to look not only at the structure of the official economy, but also of the other aspects of social life that support the economy. The organization of our relation to nature, the organization of social reproduction, the organization of political life. These are all conditions for the possibility of a capitalist economy. And I think we imagined socialism too narrowly in the past. We thought that socialism was simply changing the ownership of the means of production and the organization of paid work, whereas in fact, what we really need is an expanded view of what socialism is. We need to think about how to change the relation of production and reproduction, of politics and the economy, of culture and nature. And standard communist approaches were completely problematic. They thought you could simply liquidate the distinction between the political and the economic. That was a disaster. They didn't have an ecological consciousness. That was a disaster. And they didn't really solve the relation of production and reproduction, although I think they did somewhat better than capitalist societies did with respect to that. So we have a huge amount of work to do. Now I'm assuming that some form of socialism, a feminist, ecological, anti-racist socialism, is the end goal. You might not agree, others might not agree. We don't have to worry about that right now. I think of left-wing populism as a kind of transitional strategy that might lead to this form of democratic, feminist, ecological, anti-racist socialism. But who knows if that's where we end up or not. What we need to do now is identify the key structural problems and figure out how to solve this crisis by changing those structures. Whether we end up with something that would be called socialism or a new form of capitalism a better form of maybe there can be such a thing. I don't know. I sort of think that right now, that climate change is such a pressing issue that I'm skeptical that there actually could be a form of capitalism that could change the whole energy basis of the economy, that could simply quickly defossilize. And that's what we have to do if we're going to survive. So I think there are reasons to be skeptical about the future of capitalism, but my official position is agnostic. Let's try it and see.
Esto es muy interesante, creo que era Slavoj Žižek el que hacía uno de sus chistes habituales diciendo: hemos visto en muchas películas el fin de la humanidad, pero prácticamente no hemos visto en ninguna el fin del capitalismo o la superación del capitalismo por otro sistema económico, por un sistema poscapitalista. Estamos llegando al final, nos queda en primer lugar la rueda de reconocimiento. Yo te voy a presentar una serie de caras, de figuras, y quiero pedirte que los describas en 2 o como mucho en 3 frases. Empiezo con Karl Marx.
A genius. Right now I'm teaching a seminar on the Grundrisse, and it's revelatory. But he had some blind spots, and we can't reject his insights, but we need to resituate them in a broader framework.
Mary Wollstonecraft.
Another kind of genius, a rebel, a brilliant woman. And what I really appreciate about her is that she was taking on the most advanced emancipatory thinking of her time. Rousseau, the French Revolution, Jacobinism. And that's what feminists have to do today. We have to take on the most advanced, enlightened thinking of our time and show its gender blind spots.
Michel Foucault.
Fantastic, so interesting. Of all the post-structuralist French thinkers, he's the one who will survive, who has given us the most useful set of tools for analyzing power relations and discursive relations in society. However, we can't accept his broad framework. We need to take his analytic tools and use them in a framework that is truly anti-capitalist.
Jürgen Habermas.
Someone I have had close relationships with and have learned a lot from, and I remain a huge fan of his early work on the public sphere, on legitimation crisis, which is an underappreciated and very relevant work for our time. It's about the crisis of social democracy. If we could do for the crisis of neoliberalism what he did for the crisis of social democracy, that would really be important. However, Habermas somehow led critical theory on a path later that brought it too close to liberalism and lost the radical edge.
Judith Butler.
She's a friend and someone I admire very much, a truly brilliant philosopher. If I could say something critical, I would say that Judith...
Difícil de leer.
What?
Difícil de leer.
Well, no. Actually, I think her writing has become much simpler and more clear. As this happens, young people start out trying to prove how smart they are, and they make things very complicated. And then as they grow more confident, they learn to write and speak more simply. And I think that's the case with her. But no, I would say that Judith has very great and appropriate ambitions to deal with very difficult problems. But I think her conceptual framework is not adequate to the problems she likes to deal with because it is too Foucauldian or psychoanalytic. Those currents are important and useful, Foucault and psychoanalysis. But you still need a structural, let's say, Marxist, feminist, ecological paradigm to situate them in.
Nos queda ya solo el cuestionario. ¿Quién ha podido ser una maestra o un maestro para ti?
I've had several, not really one person. I had an important relationship and learned a lot from the American pragmatist philosopher Richard Rorty, whose politics I don't quite agree with, but who helped me break free of the tyranny of analytic philosophy and gave me the courage to think and speak in my own voice. So he remains important to me. And I learned from him the importance of getting away from metaphysical foundations and to think in a historical way, like a good left Hegelian. Habermas was an important dialogue partner, and Foucault was also. I guess those three are my most important living. They were then living. Two of them now are dead. Yeah.
Un referente político para ti.
Well, the New Left, the feminist movement, and most recently, Bernie Sanders. I think what Bernie Sanders did in 2016 was a little miracle, and he has shifted the entire Democratic Party well to the left in the United States. In the United States, we have a two-party system and an electoral system that makes it very difficult for third, fourth, fifth parties to get off the ground. So in most cases, the struggle for the left is a struggle within the Democratic Party, and the Sanders wing of the party is extremely interesting, and it attracts all kinds of young people who are interested in radicalism. I would say more than any other single figure in the United States, he has made an enormous difference. He's not perfect. His thinking is a little anachronistic. When you ask him what democratic socialism means, he says Denmark, which is not a good answer. But still, I mean, he's changed the discourse. It's been quite remarkable.
What book would you recommend to read to everyone?
My goodness. Well, if I could, if I could say Feminism for the 99%, or again, another self-serving book. I have a new book which is also now in Spanish called Capitalism, A Conversation in Critical Theory with Rahel Yegi, that tries in a more philosophical and theoretical way to explain this broader view of capitalism that I've been describing to you. But my goodness, there are so many really important things to read. I would definitely encourage people to read Butler, to read Chantal Mouffe, to read, there's great work in eco-Marxism. This is one of the most exciting new areas. I would recommend people read Jason Moore, Capitalism in the Web of Life, and Andreas Malm, Fossil Capital. That is a brilliant book. These are really great new contributions.
Please recommend a movie, a very special movie for you.
Ooh. Well, I mean, in recent films, I loved a Japanese movie called Shoplifters. Is that playing here? It's about a collection of people that organize themselves as a family, although they're not biologically related, but they live off of petty crime in Tokyo, and the difficulties of life cause them to treat one another badly when things get tough. So it's an interesting picture of Japanese society, of class, of criminality, of what a family is, and of the contradictions, of the difficulties of having a good family life in a present society.
I would like to know a special song for you. A song you like to listen, a song you like to listen in order to remember something very special.
Yeah. I guess I would go back to the folk music of the 1960s, to Joan Baez, to Bob Dylan. Okay. I don't know whether Dylan really deserved the Nobel Prize in Literature, but you know, as a musical figure and poet, he incarnated the spirit of my youth, and I still love these old, early Dylan.
And in order to finish the interview, I have to ask you to take with your left hand this cup and just to toast in front of the camera for the thing you like.
Okay, well, here's a toast to the feminism for the 99%. May it grow and prosper, not as a separatist movement, but as part of the broader struggle of the left to find a way out of this terrible mess we're living in and to build a new, just, and humane society.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.